Lord's hearing. Okay. Right. My favorite is the mountain, Gregor Kugane. Just because I always find it really interesting that whenever a knight is portrayed in fiction, particularly in TV, you get things like First Knight, that sort of deal, where the focus seems to always be on finesse, as opposed to how people portray, like, say, Spartans or Vikings or the Celts. The focus is less on strength. It's less on physical ability and more on skill. I always found that very, very interesting. Whenever I started doing HEMA, one thing that always fascinated me is how historically knights, fencers, medieval Renaissance period, actually got ready to do what they were going to do. Did they have specialized training? Did they just get ready purely by fencing? Was there any exercise that they did that they thought got them really fit for, fighting on the battlefield, fighting a judicial duel, doing classes at fencing school? So for the past couple of years, I've been looking into it and researching it and kind of trying to distill it all down into something that I could actually either write my paper on or make a class on at a symposium one day. And this is the result of that. Basically, I'm going to be kind of attacking this from three different zones. One, what kind of information would they actually have been pulling from back during the medieval ages and the Renaissance period to plan their specialized training? What do they think was important? What sources did they get it from? Then I'm going to actually go to, okay, so now they have this information, how do they apply it? What kind of stuff do they actually do in these roles to train themselves, to get themselves fit? And then the third zone is going to be, as a HEMA group, particularly ones that, might be stressed for time, only can meet once a week, have very few students. How can they actually take some of these things that people did historically and apply them in their class and still be able to get their fencing in at the end of the day? So the first thing that we want to start off with is, well, where do they pull from? What kind of sources did they go? Well, the first thing that comes up a whole lot is, particularly in the Renaissance period, people really had an obsession with particularly ancient Rome, though ancient Greece was in there as well. And they saw themselves often enough as heirs of this knightly tradition that came essentially from like the Old Testament, the Bible, that ran all the way through ancient Rome and ancient Greece. Whenever they read something like the Iliad, for instance, they didn't imagine hawk-like formations. They didn't imagine people necessarily riding around in chariots and throwing spears. They saw those people as knights. They saw them as people riding on horseback. They saw them on people as people fighting chivalrously. It's really interesting to read the translations from these like really valorized versions of the Iliad that were popular during the medieval period in particular, because that's how it's portrayed, particularly in art. Coming from that, they would basically, any kind of, since ancient Greek knowledge of that was basically lost everywhere but Byzantium, they were dependent on Latin sources to kind of get their understanding of how this tradition played out back then. So a really big source was Legidius. I think I'm pronouncing that right. He was a Roman writer, lived in the 4th century, wrote a manual that dealt with military logistics in particular, called the Epitoma Rei Militaris. So in the first part of that, he goes into detail as to what kind of training the Roman legion at around the year 300 would have used to get the recruits ready to fight. This is particularly, we have like a ton of surviving examples from the medieval period of the militaris. And the first section and the third section played a very large role in how they did military sieges. So some of the things that Legidius says in his manuscript that recruits should do, you can build stamina quickly with forced marches weighing with 60-pound packs, going up to 25 miles, vaulting on horseback, running, swimming whenever you couldn't do those things. And then a specialized style of training that he called at the post. He would take very heavy wooden versions of the weapons that they would use, gladius, axes on some occasions, mallets. They would smack them against these really thick wooden posts. And they would do that twice a day. as often as possible. The whole thing with this is that, if you can, essentially, if you can dodge a wrench, you can dodge a ball, right? If you can swing this heavy training gear whenever you actually get the actual weapon in your hand, the theory goes, you'll be able to do it much faster, last much longer on the battlefield. Logically, that's how we felt. Let's see. Camp chores, chopping wood, digging, navigating trenches, repairing aqueducts, all those things. It was the engineering part of warfare he saw as not only good for the knowledge for legionnaires to have, just in case something needed to be fixed quickly in a battlefield situation, but also it was a good way of maintaining fitness. I don't know if anybody here had to chop the logs over the summer to make sure you didn't freeze to death in the winter. It's pretty tiring. And so that, and usually most scholars, when they look at how the sources for what knights would have used, they kind of ended there. The one thing I thought was very interesting, you don't really hear a whole lot whenever people discuss this topic, is that particularly when people that came from Celtic backgrounds, that came from Nordic backgrounds, there were a whole lot of traditional games that I feel also played a very big role in this. For instance, Cornwall in England has a jacketed wrestling style, Cornish wrestling. People wear these jackets very much like gambesons. They grip each other by the jackets, and the whole thing is basically to yank the guy and trip him in first person to go to the ground. This has been going on for, it's mentioned in a whole lot of sources. People have traced it back, the lineage, for thousands of years. And one thing I found particularly interesting, a couple hundred years after the Battle of Agincourt, there's a ballad that mentions some groups of knights that left England to go fight in France. One of those was from Cornwall, and apparently they actually had a banner that depicted two people wrestling at the jacket, as they would have done. That was their symbol. That was their symbol of their military prowess. Welsh, the Welsh have a great tradition of lifting stones to build strength, same thing with Nordic groups. Then you have things like in Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Iceland, the tradition of glima, a wrestling style that you actually grip somebody by the belt, and you use the legs to try and trip them up as well to lift. I think that all these played a role depending on where a knight or fencer was coming from and how they would have prepared for battle. All of these things may have been sport, but they all taught skills that, standing up on your feet in a battle situation is obviously very important. All these things also built stamina, all these things also built strength. So I think that a lot of it was kind of a mix of this ancient Mediterranean culture and these Celtic Nordic influences, I think, that these knights would pull from. And you can see that in folklore and mythology as well. I mean, one of my favorite parts of Beowulf is the swimming match he has, where he's racing this guy, and then he ends up losing the race because he has to give it up and kill these sea monsters. That kind of athletic prowess was associated with heroes, was associated with warriors for thousands of years. So, hey,
what's going on?
So I think the knights would have also pulled from a lot of these examples for coming up with systems for training themselves. But another example of that is the Fianna stories from Ireland. They actually had these recruiting games where you had to jump up a certain length, throw a stone a certain distance to be able to join the warrior band. I think all that played a part. So this is where, these were the sources. So then how did knights, historical fencers, actually pull from these sources to come up with specialized training? What did he actually do? Well, kind of looking it over from the 1100s to right on up to the 1600s, there are three particular exercises, freestyle exercises, that I saw come up again and again and again. The first big one, stone lifting and stone casting. Basically, you pick up a big rock, bring it up to your chest, you throw it. This is mentioned, Geoffrey Descharnay mentions it as something that's shameful if a person couldn't do. Whenever he talks about how knights should be inured to physical strain, pain. And it's also mentioned in Talhofer. one of his nightly practices to build strength for knights, the lifting and casting of great stones, as he puts it. It's even mentioned in things like Baldassare Castiglione, who wrote a book, the Book of the Courtier, in the late 1500s. It's a sport that's very popular amongst the nobility, is what he says, and it's a good way for the noblemen to get those physical military characteristics that are so important to a Renaissance warrior. So, you know, that's a huge swath of time right there, where all these major manuscripts that we look at and we pull from to determine what chivalry was, or what the Renaissance noble would have considered important in a military context, all that, you know, includes the lifting and casting of stones. And like I mentioned earlier, the Welsh, the Icelanders, these cultures that didn't necessarily have a strong chivalric culture still considered this important for men to do. Icelanders actually had a system for fishermen. They would lay out stones of varying sizes in front of people, and depending on what kind of stone you lifted, determined what job you had on the boat. If you could only lift the weakling stone, you only had a specific task, like gutting fish. If you could lift a really huge stone, you might be a rower. You might be the guy that actually had to pull the net in, etc. Of course, the bigger stone that you lifted, the more pay you got because you had the more difficult work. So, that's one exercise that I've noticed that's pretty common to a lot of these things. The other big one are more like these aerobic style exercises. Running, particularly in armor, dancing in chainmail, or gambesons, swinging mallets, vaulting on horseback over other obstacles.